Hi, everybody. Welcome to Popular Music Books in Process. Our series is a collaboration between the Pop Conference, which gets going in a little less than 3 weeks now, so come on down to Brooklyn for that. IASPM U.S., whose global gathering will be happening in June, and the Journal of Popular Music Studies, which has a new late March issue out. So all thriving institutions. Want to thank my co-organizers, Carl Wilson, Kim Mack, Francesca Royster, and Gus Stadler for putting this thing together. It actually does require all of us working in sequence. Next week in our series, we will continue in our global vein with Andrew Simon presenting on the book Media of the Masses, Cassette Culture in Modern Egypt, a joint presentation with Christopher Silver's book, Recording History, Jews, Muslims, and Music Across 20th Century North Africa. But for today, we start in the Ukraine and then rock our way across the free world. We are joined by the authors of two almost immediately forthcoming books that will be out before summer by hook or by crook. And they are Nick Tochka and Maria Sonevytsky. God, okay, never mind. Nick's book is called Rockin' in the Free World, Popular Music and the Politics of Freedom in Postwar America, coming out on Oxford Press. He's going to talk to us first. Then Maria will be talking about a complicated project that includes not just writing about an album, but helping give it its first ever release in the world. The band, whose name I will butcher, Vopli, Vidopliassova, but we can absolutely refer to them as Veve in the future. And the album Tantsi, I'm happy to say this is the cover. These are Maria's fine liner notes. This is one of the most impressive acts of translation you will ever see, from Russian and Ukraine side by side with English, and this is mighty pretty colored vinyl. So that, let me get this right. The vinyl comes out April 22nd for Record Store Day, at which time you can read the ebook version. Come June, a digital version of the album will be available, as well as physical copies of the 33 1/3. June is also when Nick's book, Rockin' in the Free World, comes out too. So Nick's going to go first. Maria's going to go second. I'm going to also read the bios. And when Maria's presenting, she's going to be speaking with Eugene Hütz of Gogol Bordello. How exciting is that? So bios.
Just joined us. He's here.
Oh, good. Welcome, Eugene.
Hi, Eugene.
Now that he's here, he can hear his own bio. Ukrainian-born singer Eugene Hütz is best known for fronting the punk band Gogol Bordello, but his first band, oh God, I got this wrong before. Uksusnik?
Yeah, sure. Uksusnik. Close enough.
Formed during the height of the late 1980s Soviet Kyiv Underground scene, where he was also a teenage superfan of Veve. A legendary performer, fashion icon, and muse, has appeared everywhere from the Whitney Museum to the Venice Biennial, from Coachella to Glastonbury and the La Mama Experimental Theater Club. More critically, a real advocate for Ukrainian solidarity, and has put together multiple benefits, and we are so glad to welcome you to our gang in the book series today. Maria's associate professor of anthropology and music at Bard College, author of Wild Music, Sound, and Sovereignty in Europe, which won the 2020 Lockwood First Book Prize from the American Musicological Society, the immediately forthcoming book on the Tantsi album, and is now working on a third book, Singing for Lenin in Soviet Ukraine, Children, Music, and the Communist Future. She's also a singer and accordionist, performing Ukrainian vocal polyphony with Zazulka, original songs with the cabaret pop group The Debutante Hour, and a core member of the new music collective Antisocial Music in the 2000s. Gotta love it. Okay, then Nick writes about the politics of post-war music making in Eastern Europe and the United States. His first book was Audible States, Socialist Politics and Popular Music in Socialist Albania, which explored how composers in Tirana made light music at the intersection of creativity, policy, and state power. He also has a book in the 33 1/3 series on Albanian singer, composer, and media mogul Ardit Jabrea's 1977 album Project, which examines how musicians navigated privatization, shock therapy, and near civil war during Albania's first chaotic years of political transition. Now he's working on a manuscript about rock, the counterculture, and the invention of the 60s in the American imagination. He's associate professor of ethnomusicology at the University of Melbourne in Australia, where he is head of musicology and ethnomusicology, chairs the Bachelor of Music course, plays bass, a bit of ukulele, and is joining us at 7 a.m. in the damn morning. So thank you for that. Welcome to all three of you. My final little piece of information before we get these things started is we have a very active chat button on these Zoom calls. We encourage you to use it at all times. Speak your mind, write things down as they occur to you. Some of what you write down might be in the form of a question. If so, at the end of this, Carl will ask those questions and call on you to come forward and say them yourself. If not, we'll simply share whatever you wrote with the presenters at the time. All right, Carl, did I say everything I need to? Good. Nick, I think you're up first. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric, for that introduction. And thank you, Carl and Francesca, for organizing. I'm really happy to be here. Before I begin, I want to pause and acknowledge country, which is a common practice here in Naarm or Melbourne, Australia, where I'm currently living. So I live and work, and this book was largely written on the lands of the Bumurong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations, peoples that have danced, sang, made art, and made community here for generations, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Okay, so now to begin. So my name is Nick Tochka, and I'm a rockist. It took me a while to admit this, and I might now describe myself as a recovering rockist, but I expect I'll always be, in some sense, rockist. It's partly genetic. My father was also a rockist. In the early 1990s, I remember sitting down to watch the Beatles anthology with my family. I quickly moved on to the harder stuff, which I found on our living room bookshelves, Philip Norman books, Ray Coleman biographies. Next came the inevitable subscriptions to Spin Magazine and Rolling Stone, and then garage band heroics, of course. Amongst all the grunge covers that my high school band played, I can vividly recall a too fast, shouty punk rock version of Cream's Sunshine of Your Love, which I think we intended to be ironic, but was it really? All this to say that if today I have become a rock and roll skeptic, I was once a true believer. As a white teenager playing bass in amateurish bands in suburban Massachusetts at the end of history, I acquired a basic musical grammar that emphasized simplicity, rawness, authenticity, honesty. My friends and I learned a particular story about the political significance of rock music, from its riotous origins in the 1950s to its countercultural roots in the 1960s, to its anti-establishment challenge in the 1970s, to its corporate subversion in the 1980s. Guitar magazines, trade paperbacks, classic concert films, and television documentaries guided this political maturation. Above all, we learned to separate the real from the fake, artful self-expression from the soul-deadening commercial stuff. We even learned to play for real, expressing our own personal truths by imitating the sincerity we knew to listen for on record. So self-expression, individualism, the grit to speak truth to power. I'm sketching with pretty broad strokes the kinds of taken for granted common sense assumptions we held. For a long time, I held such truths to be self-evident, proof of the cultural and political significance of the kind of music my friends and I esteemed. So as everyone in this room knows, the term rockism became a popular way to label this stance. A rockist, Caliph Hassani, wrote in the New York Times, quote, isn't just someone who loves rock and roll, who goes on and on about Bruce Springsteen, who champions ragged-voiced singer-songwriters no one has ever heard of. A rockist is someone who reduces rock and roll to a caricature, then uses that caricature as a weapon. Rockism means idolizing the authentic old legend or underground hero while mocking the latest pop star, lionizing punk while barely tolerating disco, loving the live show and hating the music video. Now, counter perspectives over the past couple of decades have certainly emerged to nuance, deepen, and further this critique. But on the whole, it still rings true to me. And for sure, I suffered from what Saul Austerlitz once called, quote unquote, Rolling Stone disease. So by the time I got to grad school in the 2000s, I had learned to curb the most pathological expressions of my fandom, only occasionally cornering people at house parties to extol the virtues of bands like Mission of Burma. During this period, I began working on the project that would later become my first book, an ethnographically informed history of musique elect, or light entertainment music, in socialist and post-socialist Albania. This national popular music featured light orchestral accompaniment and, before 1990, often overtly propagandistic lyrics. Think boy meets girl love song, but they meet while constructing a hydroelectric dam for the fatherland. State commissions approved lead sheets and lyrics. In the 1970s, saxophones were even placed discreetly behind curtains on stage. So needless to say, rock music, whether Western or homegrown, was forbidden in the People's Socialist Republic of Albania. Their sole airport even had a barber for visitors, many of whom returned home with stories about trims to too long sideburns. So that project explored the intersection of state policy, the practices of musicians, and discourses of intellectuals about creativity. And as part of that project, I read, page by page, issue by issue, year by year, nearly every single edition of a weekly arts newspaper, becoming so fully absorbed in the language of communist bureaucraties that my friends joked my Albanian made me sound like a low-level party functionary. But by the end of the 1980s, or at least by the end of reading editions from the 1980s, something surprising began to happen. As Albanian political elites experimented with a cultural thaw, new kinds of articles began to appear at the end of these publications. Some were translated directly into Albanian from U.S. sources. And my interlocutors learned, just as I myself had, the power of rock as a democratic form, as manifesting a politically significant form of liberal individualism, as an expression of personal and social emancipation. Now, it seemed obvious to me that the stories my Albanian informants were telling about rock and its politics of freedom explained more about their political situation than about equality inherent in the music itself. So why hadn't I considered the opposite, that the stories Americans invented about rock and roll revealed equally significant insights about the United States? Like many fans, I had taken rock self-mythologizing at face value, but where did these stories come from? And just how deeply had they shaped my own beliefs about freedom, democracy, even the very idea of America itself? And so that became the starting point for this project, Rocking in the Free World, Popular Music and the Politics of Freedom in Postwar America, forthcoming from Oxford University Press in June. So this book explores the conditions of possibility that gave rise to a distinctly American story about the emancipatory potentials and liberal democratic values of rock music. So here's an example of that story in its mature form. Bruce Springsteen's 1989 speech inducting Bob Dylan into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The first time that I heard Bob Dylan, Springsteen begins, quote, I was in the car with my mother and we were listening to the radio, and on came that snare shot that sounded like somebody kicked open the door to your mind from Like a Rolling Stone. I ran out and I bought the single and I ran home and I put on the 45. But they must have made a mistake at the factory because a Lenny Welch song came on. The label was wrong. So I ran back, got the Dylan record, and I came back and I played it. Now, in footage from the event, you can hear the audience clap and laugh. That single might have been Welch's Since I Fell for You, a hit by the schmaltzy middle-of-the-road crooner that reached number 4 on the Billboard charts in 1963. Or it could have been A Taste of Honey, released the previous year. The cameras don't pan to Paul, George, and Ringo, who included a saccharine cover of that song on Please Please Me. But the audience is laughing in recognition. They understand that a teenaged Springsteen needed something real. That voice that quote-unquote thrilled and scared him, those lyrics that raised up the hairs on the back of his neck, He needed that snare shot, not syrupy commercial Lenny Welch. Dylan was a revolutionary, Springsteen concludes, now back at the podium. Quote, the way that Elvis freed your body, Bob freed your mind. He showed us that just because the music was innately physical did not mean it was anti-intellect. He had the vision and the talent to expand a pop song until it could contain the whole world, end quote. So in this book, Rocking in the Free World, I unpack 7 debates that allowed certain musical practices and musicians to be woven into this mythical story about the power of rock music. The book begins by examining forms of expertise about the so-called problem of the teenager in the early Cold War United States. The psychologists examining adolescence as a politically fraught stage and parsing the meaning of the phenomenon of so-called rock and roll riots as either a harbinger of brainwashing or else a natural release valve. Today's youth are war babes just beginning to feel their oats, columnist Phyllis Patel wrote in a 4-part series on rock and roll in 1956. Quote, they live in a world of mixed emotions. Prosperity has built up financial security for them and their families, so they do not want. At the same time, they hear all this talk of world insecurity, end quote. Yet Patel ultimately concluded, as would others, that the big beat might actually do some good. And here's what one high school girl tells her. Quote, it gives you a sort of freedom. It makes you relax and want to jump. Youth's gotta have freedom today, you know? End quote. The book then traces the meaning of the big beat and artists like Little Richard and Bill Haley as unofficial ambassadors to the second and third worlds. In the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, the popularity of rock and roll films, fashion, and sounds demonstrated the attractiveness of the American project. But in the second world, it represented something even more important, the truth. Wherever I went in Russia, wrote John Fell Stevenson, son of Democrat Adlai Stevenson, in a prominent feature for the New York Times, quote, I saw evidence of disbelief in official Soviet propaganda, end quote. And as American commentators often argued, the most striking example of Soviet youth's disarticulation from the communist project could be found in their love of Elvis the Pelvis and other artists. Moving into the 60s, the book examines how rock got serious, making its transition from teeny bopper fad to serious art form. The middle chapters explore the rising significance of critics. So there's Robert Shelton, hearing in Bob Dylan's early work, quote, a coruscating inquiry into the nature of personal freedom, end quote. It also explores the emergence, the birth of the very idea that rock musicians had a message. So there's Professor David McAllister, one of the founding fathers of my discipline, ethnomusicology, praising Paul McCartney and Bob Dylan and many others as the leaders of what he calls a social revolution. They are the voices of dissent of our youth. Now, in this middle section, we do meet a few strange dissenting takes. My favorite is Ayn Rand's polemical review of Woodstock. But ultimately, an uneasy accord prevails among hippies in the counterculture, new left thinkers, and an emerging liberal consensus, an accord that the rock revolution had, in some sense, succeeded. As Jeff Greenfield would write, discussing the legacy of the Beatles in 1975, quote, they changed rock, which changed the culture, which changed us, end quote. So at last, the truth about the power of rock music begins to become clear. It had been a revolution in the head all along. The final chapters examine the full-fledged birth of rock criticism, the creation of an alliance between the post-Nixon Democratic Party and musicians, the appearance of new punk rock alternatives and stories, and nostalgia for a more authentic years before rock and roll became rock. The book concludes with rock transcending all borders, becoming not an American form as much as a universal one. I'm not here for any government, Bruce Springsteen called out to East German fans in 1988. Quote, I've come to play rock and roll for you in the hope that one day all the barriers will be torn down, end quote. And by the end of the next year, well, David Crosby was playing amidst the ruins of the Berlin Wall. Quote, The best thing about our victory is we did it with Levi 501s, P.J. O'Rourke wrote in Rolling Stone. 72 years of communist indoctrination and propaganda drowned out by a 3-ounce Sony Walkman, end quote. So let me move toward concluding. There's been so much important work that's been done to explore the forgotten margins of rock music, rediscovering and reassessing the role of women, queer, and non-white musicians and fans. Rocking in the Free World takes a different tack, looking at the dominant story through its canonical figures, so folks like the Beatles, Dylan, Springsteen, Grail Marcus, and others. Their story explained the music's revolutionary potential. Rock hit you in the gut, taught you to liberate yourself, body and mind. It freed you from the social mores and structures that tried to make you unfree. The rock gospel, the revelation of that first snare hit, divided your life into 2 distinct periods, before rock and after. Its ambassadors promoted rock's message globally. Publishers and critics helped theorize its contours in the mainstream press, and a body of albums, songs, and performances, authored by figures such as Springsteen and Dylan, comprised its canon. This kind of music, it seemed, could only have originated in the United States. After all, the conditions that produced rock had also forged the national temperament of the American people, maybe even the democratic nature of the First World itself. And so nowhere would the American character of rock emerge quite so distinctly than when exported outside this free world. Electric guitars feeding back and up over the Berlin Wall, power chords ringing out to shred the Iron Curtain, rock musicians helped teach the captive peoples of the Second World the true meaning of freedom. And I'm saying this ironically, right? Coming together in song, these same musicians expressed in one voice the imperative to emancipate the developing peoples of the Third World from their bonds of backwardness. For ultimately, rock's message had revealed itself to be universal, capable of addressing the human condition itself. Or at least, that's the story. So this book unbundles the threads making up that larger narrative, tracing each constituent strand's history to its first emergence, stripping away its assumptions about the nature of the post-war world, its inhabitants, and the power of popular music. Because rock had to become enmeshed with an entire constellation of political values. And Rocking in the Free World tells the story of how Americans learned that rock and roll could set you free. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. I have to say that I've had the opportunity to have a sneak peek at the book, and it is really worth the read, not just for Ayn Rand on Woodstock, but so many other incredible gems, including, I mean, you mentioned Adlai Stevenson's son's report. It was gripping. Nick, would it be okay with you if I did my little spiel about Veve and then talked with Eugene, and then maybe we can take the questions all together? Is that okay with you?
That sounds perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Maria.
Okay, great. So Eugene, I was just going to do like a quick intro so people know what I'm talking about. And then I thought you could, yeah, okay, we'll do that. I wanted to show you a few images so that you can put some faces to names. You can see that? Everyone can see that? Okay, cool. So I want to also just say big thank you to Carl Wilson, Eric Weisbard, and Francesca Royster for organizing this so swiftly, and Nick for joining us at 7 a.m. in the morning, and Eugene, of course, also for joining us here. So I have this 33 1/3 Europe book coming out about this first Ukrainian punk band called Vopli, Vidopliassova, but as Eric mentioned, you have full permission to call them Veve. That is in fact the cool thing to do. So tell your friends, Veve, that's fine, Veve. As a person of Ukrainian heritage myself, who has studied Ukraine professionally for some decades now, it's especially meaningful for me to feel like I'm contributing to humanizing Ukrainians right now, to allow them some complex humanity in the midst of what continues to be a devastating and dehumanizing war. Russian war of aggression. So I hope one of the things you can take away is just this depiction of Ukrainians in the 1980s, full of complexity and as something radically other than the victims of an unprovoked war. This image is central to the story I tell in the book. But I'm going to just really quickly rehearse a few of the major themes in the book, and we can always return to this later if you want to hear about why this image is so important. It's published in the Communist Youth League or Komsomol newspaper, advertising the cassette album of Tantsi on March 29th, 1989, which was circulated through this really ingenious circular economy. And that's one of the stories I tell in the first chapter of the book about the various ad hoc infrastructures that supported the Kyiv Underground scene. I also touch on the particular genres of humor and the specific late Soviet archetypes that the band was parodying through their music. I talk about the relationship of the band to the Communist Youth League, to the censorship regimes, to the Ministry of Culture. And I really talk a lot about how this band allowed people who identified as neformale, nonconformists, to find new and idiosyncratic ways of identifying as Ukrainian in the late 1980s. And actually, Eugene gave me one of the absolute best interviews on that topic, which we'll get to in a second, hopefully. So I wanted to show you a tiny clip of the first Ukrainian music video to show on Soviet television in 1989 of this band, of their hit song. This is the unremastered version, but the label that's putting out the record has given us permission to circulate 3 digital tracks in advance. So I don't know, Carl, if you have that link, maybe you could drop it. So just a short clip, just so that it doesn't get censored on YouTube, but so that you can see what these guys looked like and get a sense at least of what this hit song sounded like.
Лягає день, він віддає свої надії ночі. Робітники заморились працювати. Там вогні яскраво блищуть лампи. Приходьте люди на вечір у клуб. Там будуть танці. Там.
Okay, so I cut it off at the best part, but that is in the background, you see 2 workers carrying out a sign. The sign says Tantsi. Tantsi means dances, but what's really amazing is that this sign is also instantly recognizable as communist agitprop, right? So instead of saying like Lenin lives or the glory of labor or whatever, it just says dances. And this is part of the kind of genre of humor that they were using at this time, which I have a whole chapter about in the book. Okay, and I just wanted to show you, you've already seen this, and I want to clarify because as some of the stories are coming out, this is really not an Indiana Jones story. This was not like me in the archives, discovering materials. I had an interview with Sashko Pipa, the original bass player of Vopli Vidopliassova, and he mentioned that he had the master tape from this recording session that was at the Institute of Metallurgy in Akademistechko in Kyiv. And anyway, a series of events unfolded. I physically transported the tape from Kyiv to California, but it really kind of fell into my lap because I was interested and because I was asking questions. Another discovery, I suppose, that I had early on in the project was that there was this teenage super fan who even wrote a couple articles in the cool DIY zine called Sonevytsky, and discovered that was in fact a young Eugene Hütz. Eugene, would it be okay if I showed that picture you sent to me the other day from 1980? Yeah, is that all right? So this is something that just got dug out of the archives. This is Oleg Skripka, the lead singer, dedicating this image to, there it is, to Zhenka, little Eugene, with the inscription, "Thank you for your understanding." So 1988. And then, can I show the other image from August 20? Okay, yeah. And then there they are, August 2022 at a New York City benefit for Ukraine. I really recommend everyone follow Gogol Bordello and Eugene on Facebook and Instagram. Eugene is tirelessly supporting Ukraine right now, including, I think, an event on Wednesday, right, with Spilka, this really cool artist collective at Chishama. So lots of opportunities to learn more about this. And also, I think, Eugene, you said yourself, when we were talking, that Gogol Bordello shares some DNA with Vopli Vidopliassova, right? Sonically and aesthetically. So I would love to just sort of like hear you talk a little bit again about what it was like to hear this band at the time that you heard them, in the 1980s in Kyiv. You talk a little bit like just about your impressions of the band the first time you heard them, and maybe I'll stop screen sharing at this point.
Yeah, of course. I mean, first of all, thank you for having me, and Maria. This is like, this is great, and I'm glad you asked me because it's just doesn't get any more closer to my DNA. Actually, I mean, you were showing the part of the review of the tape that was published in Молода Гвардия in the newspaper. I mean, I think my girlfriend did that cover actually.
Really?
If it's not Anya Glibina, I don't know who it could be because
I thought it was.
did
I
all
thought
the covers.
Yevtushenko. Anyway,
Oh, maybe Yevtushenko?
Alexander Yevtushenko, I think.
Maybe. Actually, I was writing some blurbs for that newspaper at the time. I was his kind of intern of Alexander Rudichenko, the guy who was running the music column. And my uncle, who's a painter, he somehow knew him and introduced me to him. And he was sending me out to write reviews about local shows. And when I was like 14, 15. So it's kind of mind-blowing that so many stimulus from back then are coming at me all at once right here. And also Nick's, I was really enjoying Nick's perspective on the situation. And, I'm very well aware of all the caricatures and that rock brings, but also not to underestimate the real gist of it and real essential power of it, because it's like it's easy to overlook them because we're so saturated with the caricaturism of rockism, which is alive and well. But at the same time, there were documentaries made about how essentially, I mean, this is kind of a little bit going out on a limb, but there was a documentary how Beatles and music of the Beatles basically contributed so majorly to collapse of Soviet bloc. And, like, it's kind of hard to argue with it if you were there at that time and the impact it made, because it's like, here we are, your Albanian, Nick's description of Albanian music is a perfect description of Soviet music. It was like, if you were just living there, absolutely under barrage of these songs with long intros that don't fucking go anywhere, you just like kind of get an idea that a rock song is clearly coming from people who are enjoying their life much more than these people who are producing this garbage nonstop. And that alone, on a cellular level, on a physical level, is already an answer that obviously those people are, with all their problems with a capitalist society, obviously they're living a much better life still and enjoying a lot more pleasures and freedoms of life. So it's like, it's beyond analysis. It's just speaks to you on purely emotional and physical level, and your subconscious knows the answer. This is still much better than this products of dictatorship. So, and now,
and yet you have Veve though, and yet you have this amazing product, right?
I'm circling back to Veve. Don't worry, I got you. So, Veve, to take that quote of Springsteen on Bob Dylan, that Bob Dylan liberated the mind, as Elvis liberated the body. It's like Veve, what they liberated is a sense of cool Ukrainianness. It just simply unpainted that whole picture that Moscow was trying to paint for so many decades, that being Ukrainian is uncool, that Ukrainian are people who are somehow on a fringe of culture, while they simply exterminated all intellectuals and brutally murdered artists and painters and writers, methodically throughout 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on and so forth. So, of course, there was a fraction of population in Ukraine that was starting to believe it, or believing it because they were basically Russian who were relocated to Ukraine. You know what I mean? So, but as somebody who knew better, because my family is deeply Ukrainian from various parts of Ukraine, I was, we had a sort of mistrust towards anything that's coming from Moscow, and underlying suspicion about anything they say. Obviously, anything Soviet was subject to our major skepticism. So Ukraine just kind of, so VV just kind of it came out on the wings of punk movement, which was already quite popular in the air amongst kids, listening to the Clash and Devo and Sex Pistols and PIL and and Gang of Four and GBH and Joy Division. That was like, it was there for us. But to see a band that's coming from the tree of that music with accordion singing Ukrainian immediately repainted the whole picture that for the people who thought that maybe Moscow is right, maybe, like that's where the culture is. It was immediately like, fuck that, the culture is definitely, it kind of made look, all those wannabe bands from Moscow kind of made them look kind of pretty inept, actually, in terms of punk rock, because this was a real punk rock. But that was like it was a big fuck you to that whole camp. And it was also very much, it was Ukrainian Sex Pistols in a lot of ways. And I'm saying Sex Pistols are not the Clash because I love the Clash. Joe Strummer had an immense impact on me, and it's just, it lingers on. But Sex Pistols, like no other band, had a danger and instantaneous power to put you absolutely from one boat onto another overnight, and VV had that power for that initial period,
Can I burst in just to say, like, your version of this story is something I developed so much in the book because so many people testified to this experience in similar ways, right? That like the appearance of VV allowed them to associate being Ukrainian with being cool. And the fact that that was overcoming this kind of, I mean, in the book, I write about it as a sort of like inferiority complex born of being colonized, right? It's like, it's a sort of the beginning stages of decolonizing was thinking like, oh, maybe it isn't true that the Ukrainian language is only the language of the like low-class peasants and the past, right? But also that it could be like a cool language of the future. I mean, that is a story that was repeated in so many interviews, and I love hearing you talk about that too. I also think just the fact that it was a growing political awareness is so consequential for the moment we're in now, right? Where like a lot of different kinds of people are starting to identify themselves with this project of Ukraine in a moment of existential, confrontation. Eugene, I thought maybe I'd ask you another question as a way to sort of also pivot into a space between Nick and my books. And then, I don't know, Carl, Eric, would this be a good moment also to just say we could open up for other questions from other people after Eugene answers this question?
People are gradually getting some questions for the Q&A, but you take the time you want to dialogue between the three of you as well.
Okay. So Eugene, you left Kyiv in like 1990, right? To come to Vermont, 89. And you in one of our interviews, you told me about that experience of moving between the kind of DIY scene in Kyiv to the DIY scene in Vermont. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it was like to move between these two worlds that had more continuities than we might expect, but also had some real differences.
Yeah, definitely, people always kind of anticipate this kind of like story about culture shock that one may experience. You're coming from Soviet Ukraine, and it was Soviet Ukraine, and to the States, and there's supposedly some kind of incredible culture shock shall ensue. But it didn't, because punk rock culture has very it's a very particular kind of thing, and it's for the simplicity of explanation, you know, like you mentioned the word neformale, you know, a counter nonconformist. I mean, it's just somewhere in between that and gangs, basically. You know, it's not like so benign. I mean, there were neformale in Kyiv that were pretty dangerous, you know, and some of them were less dangerous, you know. So it's kind of like that Warriors movie, you know, where like some of those gangs are kind of looking like they're fantasy gangs, and some of those gangs look pretty dangerous, you know. So coming from that kind of context, it's very street, and you have to know how to maneuver between all these things, and you know, between punks who are more artistic and punks who are more violent. And you know, punk rock always had that dichotomy about it. But because that gives you kind of understanding of all these urban complexities, you know, when you're 14, 15, 16 years old, so you're not talking about something from the book, it's real life experience. And so consequently, you know, punk rock attracting so many people who are eccentric by the nature or just more outspoken, you know, you're grouped with that kind of people. And consequently, that culture there is, you may say that it's kind of people who are more for real or whatever, you know, something along those lines. So moving from that atmosphere in Kyiv to that same and catching on with basically punk rock and hardcore kids here in the States, had zero, there was no any kind of miscommunication. You know, you could communicate by just naming bands that you like, you know, all night long, you know, which is what I did, you know, and I hit it off with a great group of punk rockers and hardcore kids here. So for me, kind of punk rock served as kind of humanitarian cultural corridor in that sense, you know, and I don't know what I would do without it, because being you know, immigrant punk rocker is it's a kind of double whammy, you know, because you're not only fringed on a cultural sense by being a punk rocker, it's also immigrant community. It sounds like it's a community where, you know, but when in reality, it's a lot of people crammed together in a refugee house who speak all different languages, and, you know, which is what happened for me. So, you know, you're kind of on the fringe of that too. But because of punk rock and people bringing people together, you surpass all that, and you kind of go straight into environment of, you know, intellectually, you know, stimulated kids who are reading, you know, Noam Chomsky and Maximum Rock and Roll magazine and you know, anarchist literature, and just looking at, and, you know, going out to see I don't know, Hare Krishna hardcore band, you know, picking up a brochure on, you know, vegetarianism and you know, and Hare Krishna lifestyle. And that's punk rock, you know, that's all those progressive ideas that you will not get anywhere amongst any yappies, you know. And in that sense, there was no cultural shock at all. It was all win-win, you know. And even I have to say, now everybody is aware of the, you know, Ukrainian trident as a symbol of Ukraine. But in the first time I saw trident, Trizub, the first time I saw it was at Vopli show. A group of punk rockers came from Lviv and Ternopil, and they, on the inside of their jackets, they had Trizubs, which was back then illegal to expose. So, you know what I mean? I thought, wow, that's fucking cool. You know what I mean? Like, this shit is for fucking real. And the emergence of that, I didn't see that on in any kind of even Gorbachev allowed kind of a new program or something like that. That was still in a punk rock circle.
Yeah. I tell that story in the book too, actually, because you told it to me, and it really is incredible to think about that space, that like space of nonconformity, as also a space of starting to identify with the Trizub, with the Ukrainian national symbol, right? Thank you for that.
Absolutely. It's just edutainment at its best, really.
Cool. Carl, is this a good moment to open it up to some questions?
Sure. Maybe just to get things started, we do have a few questions, but I think maybe to start, maybe Nick could give some reflections about how what you two have been talking about intersects with the concerns on his book. We can transition from there.
Yeah, thanks, Carl, and thanks, Eugene and Maria, and thanks especially Eugene for pointing out. I guess the on the ground lived experience of what I'm trying to deconstruct here is these myths, and I guess my biggest reflection here is has to do, I guess, with the function of these ways of thinking about rock music in a local context within sort of a network of musicians and listeners and fans like that you were part of, as opposed to, I guess I'm trying to look at this from a higher up perspective, trying to look at sort of what these myths and their creation do within kind of the American political imaginary in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, ending up in this kind of American triumphalism at the very moment where these discourses are, being made manifest, being made real and really meaningful for you and your friends in the 1980s. It's contributing to a form of American chauvinism and nationalism that we're at the end of history, and after all of these Cold War, post-war struggles between the free first world, the unfree second world, and the modernizing backwards third world, all in scare quotes, of course, that these myths can function in such radically different ways in different contexts. So I don't see it necessarily as invalidating sort of your lived experience at all. It's actually kind of remarkable, the plasticity of these discourses and ways of thinking about freedom and thinking about cultural practice, that it can do and means such radically different things in different contexts. I guess that was my big thing I was thinking about. I was thinking about whether or not the argument in my book was actually completely wrong and I should ask Oxford to pulp it. I don't think so, because I got to get, I'm in an academic job. I got to keep this job and get promoted.
Nick, to be fair to but Nick, to be fair, you write precisely about the plasticity of the meanings of freedom. The fact that Rockin' in the Free World can be sung by Bernie Sanders supporters in the same breath as Trump supporters are using it at a rally to signify freedom in radically different ways, right? So, and I think you also talk about yourself as a rockist, right? There's a sort of personal relationship to wanting those myths to be true, right? And I think there's enough space in the book that you don't have to do anything drastic.
Yeah, it's actually interesting, Maria. I don't know if this would be a place where we can, I don't want to put you on the spot, speak about sort of our personal relationship to the music. I mean, I wrote this book, it's intended for kind of a broader audience. So to kind of introduce and unpack some of these debates about rockism and rockist discourses for, people who might not have sort of been discussing these terms like we in popular music studies have been, but it does come from a place of sort of, recognition. I do get goosebumps when I hear certain kinds of music and certain bands, and my personal relationship, I feel like, has really evolved and shaped how I approach this. As I get older, sort of maybe I can have a little bit of ironic distance, but when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, I'm still making my kids listen to some really, really terrible 80s hardcore. I was just going to say, Maria, that I one of the things I really appreciated about your book, because I also got a sneak preview of Maria's book, was about how you tied this story about 1980s and this this band and this album to our current political moment. I wonder if you did have any sort of thoughts, or you could share a little bit about how you've mentioned Eugene and his activism around this moment, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about what this story of the 1980s Ukraine identities, plural, might sort of mean for a more nuanced understanding of Ukraine today.
I mean, I'm happy to speak to that. I think Eugene already put it kind of beautifully, which I think, I mean, and, you know, I've learned this from Eugene and other people I interviewed, but it's also true for me personally that when I first heard and then later saw this video of Vevez Tantsi once it was uploaded to YouTube, I'm a little bit younger, right? So I didn't grow up with his music. I didn't grow up in Kyiv. I grew up in the diaspora here in North America. It really, like, I was just like, whoa, what is this? How is this really cool Ukrainian thing out in the world? And I never knew about it. And it really allowed me to attach myself and affiliate and want to affiliate with that identity, right? To be like, I'm proud of being Ukrainian because there's these really cool idiosyncratic ways of being Ukrainian. And I do think that today is existentially important, actually, for Ukraine, not only through punk rock, you know, but I do think that's one important vector. And I think what you agree or?
Yes, yes. Yeah. Please continue. Please.
Yeah, you know, and so I do think, like, again, like one of the things I hope to show with this project is that whatever stereotypes people here have about Ukrainians, which for the most part, there's a lack of knowledge about Ukraine. There's a lack of imagination about who Ukrainians are. If you know about Ukraine in the last year, it's as the victims of this Russian war of aggression. But the fact is that there has been this really interesting, I think we could call it a post-colonial kind of manifestation of Ukrainian identity that affiliates through things like Vevez punk rock, and did at the time and continue to today.
You know, actually, I'd like to just add to the fact that, you know, you have to please keep in mind that Veve is not only cool band that came out of there by any means. As a matter of fact, right in the same time with Veve, there was a whole cluster of bands like Brate Гадюкини and Kalevsky Assessor and Rabota Ho and Kamuvnis. And yeah, there was a big movement of this, and Vika was there. You know, it was just, the scene was there. So, and their vector, I love that word. Thanks for bringing that up. Their vector was distinctly Western, and that was always a very important feeling and distinction that you had when you grew up there, that it's like everything on TV is trying to make you look east towards Moscow, and entire nation is listening and doing something that's actually vectored west. And now it's just in full-blown motion, where Ukraine is basically showing its Western vector, which evolved over the last 1,000 years. You know, if you go into tribal history of Ukraine, you will see that it's actually complete. It's aligned itself with Europe 1,000 years ago, as Moscow aligned itself with nomadic tribes of Genghis Khan and that whole Orda. It's a completely different mentality, and it's just historical facts that yet to be understood. But getting back to this, there was a whole cluster of this, and it's a kind of the frustration that of any Ukrainian, of, you know, a painter or a designer or a writer, is that somehow this Russian force-fed, Soviet force-fed stereotype actually leaked out into the world, where Ukrainians are supposedly somehow more of you know, this kind of agricultural people and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, back in 1,000 years ago, you know, but you know, it's actually absolutely the other way around, because they borrowed the Cyrillic alphabet from us. you Yeah,
From the Bulgarians first.
Yeah, of course, it comes from Bulgaria. It comes from it's Greek monks, Cyril and Methodius, who invented the alphabet, upgraded that alphabet, and Kyivan Rus has adopted that alphabet, 400 or 500 years before Moscow even existed. So it's like, what the fuck are they even talking about? That's just garbage for infantile morons that don't check on anything. So
I mean, it's a very messy part.
It's very frustrating to be a Ukrainian intellectual and know thousands of names of Ukrainian intellectual history and still deal with some kind of people's misunderstanding that iceberg exists. It's actually pretty aggravating, but we have to get patient and get through it somehow. So, for example, for you, Maria, you were like, wow, Veve made me feel like it's cool to be Ukrainian. It's like, it's not just because Veve. I mean, there's tons of things that you can.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't just Veve for me either,
It was, yes, I'm sure, but it's a kind of there's a lot to that manifestations of that culture. I mean, pick up on, Ukrainian futurism or Ukrainian cubism studies, whatever. You'll find it all. Ukrainian jazz, all those things are exterminated by Stalin, methodically, just to keep painting that picture. So, it's important to keep that in mind, that it's actually, Veve was like a very striking, cool emblem of that iceberg,
And that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And made you aware instantly, connect all these dots. Wow. That teacher in our school, because I was still in the high school then. Wow, that teacher in our school who is from, Bandere or a stream, is actually even cooler than we thought, because he speaks in that dialect, It created taste for authenticity. It popularized young people's kids, taste for authenticity and quest for authenticity, because this bleached out Sovietized version of Ukraine nobody was buying that to begin with. It was force-fed, but nobody was buying. So people latched onto it, and Veve skyrocketed in popularity. And I do have to say that, it's punk rock is a very different thing from rock. It's not something that is a subject actually to a lot of this criticism. It's actually indomitable in that sense, because here we have a situation. Here we have a situation with invasion that starts one year ago, and somehow, now we all know, a lot of people are championing Ukraine and showing their support and much respect. It's like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months later. But the people who really stood up and showed support to Ukraine immediately, they were not people from the charts, and they were not old rockers. Those were people affiliated with punk rock. It was Patti Smith, Ministry, Jello Biafra from Dead Kennedys, Agnostic Front. So there is your answer, because it's a culture of people that has their judgment about the situation very on a common sense level and is ready to go. Ice-T, it's just like, those are the people who can see through certain matrix. They don't get, they're too street smart to get tangled up in some mythology, You're right, Nick, people are up against mythology, and they're fighting it, and they can't find their way around it in a lot of ways. And as Joseph Campbell was saying, the whole thing, myths need to be unraveled. Every hero's journey is basically about unraveling their own myth. So yes, but in this particular angle, this streak of musicians kind of is not really a subject to that analysis, because they're the first one to dispel all those myths. And they come and say it like it is. And so invasion begins, and the first benefit for Ukraine is on 5 days later, while everybody in Hollywood is still sitting in like, oh, wow, maybe I shouldn't say anything, you know? You know what I mean? So.
Thanks, Eugene. I think that this might be a good time to turn to some of the questions from the Q&A. Our first question was from somebody who just had to leave us at the end there, but I think it was a good transitional question out of what Eugene was just talking about, because the question of this like rock versus punk rock, there was kind of a question about the genealogy of this in Ukraine and how this compares to the Russian version of the story, but specifically kind of whether the emergence of punk in the Ukraine happened all at once, or whether there was kind of a gradual evolution. I think it'd be helpful to have some of that backstory, Maria.
I can speak to that briefly. I mean, Eugene just touched on it. So in Ukraine, which we're going to say without the before Ukraine, sorry to be.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I knew I slipped there.
My sacred mission as a Ukrainian to correct that. There is a prehistory for sure. So some of the writing that's been done on the Ukrainian scene talks about the 1980s as actually the fourth wave of Ukrainian rock. VV really kind of has been often labeled as the first Ukrainian punk band, but even that, as Eugene says, is not entirely true, right? Like bands like Koleski Assessor and which were sort of in this in-between genre. To that end, VV also, you know, pinning them down genre-wise is actually pretty tricky. For people who actually listen to this record, you'll hear a real like stylistic diversity. It's not all like, you know, angular punk rock or anything by any means. They're drawing from many different sources. And when I talked to the band members about what influenced them at the time, you know, they gave me wide-ranging answers from, you know, from some of the, you know, from the band Trio to some of the, or they would say like the worst, you know, the worst Soviet state-sanctioned popular music, like The Boy and the Girl Fall in Love as they're building the hydroelectric station. Nick, that's such a wonderful description. You know, that kind of song, they would just use those materials and replay them. So one of the songs on the album is a lullaby, like in the style of a Soviet children's lullaby. So there's a kind of eclecticism at the heart of it. So even like making a precise genealogy is really tricky. But I am tempted to show you this incredible image, but I won't right now. I'll just say it's in the book, which is something that was published also in the Communist Youth League newspaper, which is a map, and they called it the map of the Kyiv Underground. Eugene, I don't know if you know this one. I'll send it to you, but it's definitely Yevtushenko, and it's the literal map of the Kyiv metro, which has 3 intersecting lines. And each stop on the metro is labeled with one of the bands of the Kyiv Underground. And each line represents different genre trajectories, right? So from like theatrical post-punk into like indie rock, you know, and VV is actually in the beating heart. They're at the Maidan Nezalezhnosti, which today the Maidan Nezalezhnosti station. And so it also just gives you a sense of that network and just how broad it was and how eclectic it was, from the like, you know, experimental jazz scene to the theatrical post-punk to the everything in between. I don't know that I answered your question very well, but that is to also say, I want to mention also that important precursors in the 1960s were bands like NA, for example, who were not doing punk rock, they were doing rock music. But I did do a number of interviews with one of the band members there. And one of the interesting stories in the book is that when the music video of Tantsi appeared on Soviet television, the producer anticipated that it would be a scandal. And she did, in fact, get an official reprimand from the Communist Party for showing the video. But she also convened a panel of experts to sort of explain why the video should be shown. And one of the experts was Taras Petrenenko, who was the singer of that band from the 60s. So there was a much longer, and at that time they had been a fully kind of non-state sanctioned band. They were in constant conflict with the KGB. And so there is this really interesting longer history that I tell a little bit of through the prism of the VV album.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Eric, do you want to raise your 1989 question?
I certainly can. So 1989 we thought was like the collapse of the Berlin Wall and capitalism wins and this and that. And then we had a rude awakening on 9/11, and we no longer talk about the end of the Cold War. And a lot of things have changed. So here we are with two books, one Q to a 1989 song, Keep on Rockin' in the Free World, the other Q to a 1989 album by Veve. I'm thinking about that other punk rock band with accordions, the Mekons, and their song about going through the wall, no pain at all, in Memphis, Egypt, released in 1989. Should we stop thinking about 1989 as the last moment of rock and punk and start seeing it as this super complicated moment with questions being asked that we wouldn't even realize were important questions until the 2020s? Do you see that moment in 1989 differently at the end of your projects, or just at this moment in time? Anything you'd want to say about 1989 is part of my question.
That's addressed to Maria or Nick?
All of us. Nick, do you want to tackle it first, maybe, and then maybe
yeah, maybe I can begin with just kind of a simple observation. And this isn't original. I take this from Karl Pletsch, who's a social scientist who wrote about this sort of three-world scheme, this idea that the world is divided up into a first, second, and third world, and that these have qualities that are sort of immanent, that they have essences. And I think that a lot of what I try to do in my book is sort of ask, really? That was sort of an animating way to think of that. That was a productive way to think about the world. And of course, it's not just in discourse. It's not just in the realm of ideas. It gave rise to, and I'm going a little bit further away from your question here, Eric, but it gave rise to funding schemes. The reason that I learned Albanian for free in Arizona in the early 2000s was that there were Cold War era schemes that said it's a political priority for the United States for people to learn Albanian. Of course, they've cut that program because they realized that it was just a handful of guys going over to study Albanian pop music. The institutionalization of this sort of three-world scheme, it did take 10 to 15 years or so for that to begin to start to break down. I think that, of course, we're now seeing sort of the emergence in the United States. Of course, this is kind of a US-centric conversation we're having. The emergence of sort of new Cold Wars, and sort of here in Australia, for example, we have sort of this new sort of institutionalization of a distinction between us and China, for example. So I guess that's just an observation I want to begin with, that it's a really a crude scheme for thinking about the world, and yet it did animate quite a bit of thinking about culture and art and subjectivity and personhood and the intersections between all of these things.
Eugene, do you want to speak to 1989?
Sure. I mean, I was actually, it was a pretty tumultuous moment. I was exiting Ukraine with my family right at that time, and I was all torn apart because my, big part of me, let's call it my higher self or whatever, knew that that's a good move because we, being persecuted by, KGB for my father is not a good lifestyle. And, going to Afghanistan, which was coming up for me, was not a good prospect either. And, we're already on a shit list basically for the Soviets, like before I even reached 8th grade, like we already had all files on us. So yeah, let's do that. And there's unity on that. But at the same time, I was leaving the situation. I was leaving my girlfriend, all my friends, and my band that was already in that charts of Alexander Rudachenko that you were just showing. And we were doing great, We had our album sent off to Brian Eno, who was scouting around Soviet Union for new bands. And it's like, for all I know, we could have been the new, Brian Eno discovery, Sounds pretty fucking good. So, yeah, I had to let all that go. And plus, so it kind of erased my any kind of youth, what you're supposed to be doing at that age. I was not doing that for a number of years because I was dislocated, working in constructions and intersections and stuff like that. But so I remember the time very vividly. Actually, we were in an Austrian refugee camp when the Berlin Wall was taken down. And so it's like, oh, wow, what the fuck happened? So can we like go back now? Or, what are we doing? So, but we can't go back now. But then, but even if we could go back now, is that really the promise? So academically speaking, we can kind of, like Eric was saying, like, was it really that time that, is era defining and in the way that we thought it was? Academically speaking, we can riff on that forever because, hey, it's planet Earth. Everything is subject to those algorithms of empires coming together and falling apart. This is still that planet with the same gravity, and all of that is gonna keep happening. But at the same time, I think that, I'm your field research here. I'm not academician. I don't speak from, I was there, and I was, I'm glad that Maria asked me to do this because it's exciting, because I'm like a fossil for you, basically. I was there. I did it. I was in writing reviews of VV at that time. I saw their very first show. Then I got on on train, left the country as the Berlin Wall was collapsing. So in retrospective, here we are sitting in this completely new Rubik's Cube we're trying to put together of a globe. But I do have to say that it actually was definitely a positive change, in my opinion. And it's going to be lingering on in algorithms that are yet to take the planet, But those are definitely undeniable things that had to happen and happened in the right time and liberated a lot of people, if not economically, then at least mentally. Not all of them, but a lot. And it is demonstrated the vectors that were deeply there, and showing Ukrainian westward a vector, because this is a one really, really silly thing that I ran into some time into, like, even my friends who are pretty alert people, pretty savvy on a socio-political front. A lot of people fall into this some kind of thing that East and this whole Soviet Union, they were some kind of great alternative to, and some kind of a promise of escaping the traps of capitalism. It's like, it's not an alternative. It's a fucking absolute dead end. And that's my opinion from an experience. So as far as like weighting one against the other, it is certainly the trajectory that Ukraine is showing now. People talk about proxy war and how, how the West is using Ukraine as an instrument to win this war with Russia. But it's just simply untrue, because it's people's struggle. We can talk here and talk that all the proxy paranoid strategies, conspiracy theories all day. The real reality of it is the real dudes, brothers and sisters like me, who was there on the first VV show, went to Maidan and demonstrated Ukrainian people's vector. And they didn't have anybody yapping in their ear what they need to do. They knew what to do because their parents and grandparents are deeply Ukrainian with a deep resistance to Moscow. That's why they did it. I know these dudes. So all the political theater and proxy polemics are like out of the window. Like, let's please not have that and realize this is people's struggle and demonstration of their will.
Eugene, can I jump in just to say, I wasn't there in 1989. And well, first of all, I just want to say you're so much more than a fossil to me. But I'm so grateful to have your lived experience, because I wasn't there. I'm a researcher now trying to reconstruct something of it. But I do think it's important to your point, right, that there's been so much tendency in the media, the Anglophone media, to deprive Ukrainians of agency. They're just the puppets of the West or Brussels or whatever. But I think part of the story of 1989 is also very much the story of the 80s in Ukraine. So the VEVE record comes out in March of 1989. The Berlin Wall falls in November. So it's before that moment. So we can sort of even just extrapolate from that, right? Things were already changing. And many people who I interviewed for this project stressed how quickly things were changing, like week to week, right? This was the Gorbachev period of reforms. We have, relative openness. We have the possibility for worker-led cooperatives that aren't managed by the state anymore, which is how the cassette album comes to life in the first place. And we have the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which is an event in April of 1986 that really starts a process of national awakening among Ukrainians. This has sometimes been called eco-nationalism, right? But the fact that the Soviet government does not inform the Ukrainian citizenry in Kyiv, 70 kilometers downstream from the reactor, that there was a huge atomic explosion, and they allow them to go forward on May Day and parade down the main street, was such a betrayal of trust. It really started things in motion, right? A kind of sometimes a nihilism among people, but also just an awareness, like we are not going to trust the government. And so a lot of what happens by 1989 is the culmination of much longer processes. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, actually the mistrust is strengthened towards the system to a quite revolutionary level, because, I was 13 at the time, and as a matter of fact, my father and I went boating on that day, and we were going to go up to the Kyivan sea, that artificially created sea, towards Chernobyl. But it was so stormy that we just stayed in a bay and did not go there, luckily. And then we were, I still have pictures from that day, and they look overly exposed. And I don't know, maybe that was my bad photography, but already, who the fuck knows now? But what I'm saying is that we did not hear it from Soviet TV or radio. I heard it from BBC, because we were, as I said, completely pro-Western and listening to, broadcasting from BBC. We were listening to rock and roll program, and they informed us actually about that. It was, static, covered with static, BBC broadcasting that, everybody who's in Ukraine, check this out. There was a atomic avaria, they didn't call it disaster yet, but there's some definitely up. The radiation is higher already in Finland and Sweden and Poland. And we chose, there was these prescribed ways of, prescribed by schools and workplaces, prescribed ways of evacuation from Kyiv about 3 or 4 weeks down the road. But most of people like us, we just decided to go back much sooner. We decided to go back where our families came from. So we went about 1,000 kilometers away to Kamenka, where my family from. So these are very rutical families, and as we got there, I think because a lot of people did that, they got closer to the root. It's actually the first time that I heard that we had a Romani ancestry in our family was because of this family. Nobody in Kyiv was talking about it, because it was it was disadvantages, according to the Soviets, that's just another chance to put you on a shit list, So that was kind of under the carpet. But there in the village, they were just oh yeah, you didn't know? What's up, dude? And that way, that just had a lot to do with getting closer to your root and strengthening a lot of people's suspicion that, like, I think Moscow is just a bag of lies, top to bottom, you know, and here we go again. This is pretty major, and they didn't do anything. You know?
I think on that note, we're running out of time. So unfortunately, there are a few questions we didn't get to, but I think that's understandable given the subject matter and all the places that it reaches out to right now. So I just want to thank Maria and Nick and Eugene for being here and giving us this great conversation. And on a final note, remind you that next week on April 17th, Andrew Simon and Christopher Silver will be with us talking about popular culture and music in North Africa and Egypt. And we hope you'll come back and join us then. But huge thanks to our speakers today, and everybody seek out the books.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.